What would you do if you woke up one day to find a complete stranger standing in your bedroom? Not just any stranger, but a being from a distant world, with deep blue skin and eyes filled with secrets you can't begin to fathom? Michael's eyes fluttered open in a dimly lit room, a faint blue light filtering through the curtains. The air was cold and eerily quiet. It took him a moment to realize he wasn't alone. Standing beside his bed was a girl, or rather, a being, with skin that shimmered in a deep shade of blue, with luminous patterns running down her body. She was like nothing he had ever seen. He sat up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to shrink as their eyes locked. Her eyes were deep and shining, as if holding an entire universe of mysteries within them. She stood still, silent and watchful, the dim light from the window casting a soft glow over the strange patterns on her skin. "Who are you?" Michael asked, his voice raspy with a mix of confusion and concern. The girl didn't answer right away. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, and Michael could sense a tension in the air, as if they were standing at a crossroads of fate. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" she finally asked, her voice sounding like an echo from a distant place, unlike any language Michael had ever heard. The question made Michael pause. Afraid? He should be, right? Standing before him was an alien being, entirely different, full of mystery, and possibly dangerous. But instead of fear, all he felt was a strange curiosity and fascination. He didn't know why, but there was something about her, a silent invitation, a mystery that begged to be unraveled. "Maybe," he replied, "because I want to know your story." And that's when their story truly began, a story that would take them beyond the boundaries of what Michael ever thought possible. A story not just about survival and trust, but also about discovering the deepest parts of oneself and the universe we think we know so well. Where would Michael and this alien girl go from here, and what awaits them in the journey ahead? Only time would tell. Part 1, The Encounter. The cool, dimly lit room was filled with an eerie blue glow emanating from the half-open window. The curtains fluttered slightly, allowing slivers of moonlight to pierce the darkness. Inside, a young man lay unconscious on a large bed, his breathing steady, his face calm as if in the midst of a deep, dreamless sleep. His name was Michael, a scientist stationed on the remote outer rim of the galaxy, far away from the comforts of Earth. Standing by the bed, illuminated by the soft, ethereal light, was an alien girl with azure skin and piercing bioluminescent markings tracing her limbs like celestial tattoos. Her lithe figure moved with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, every muscle sculpted to perfection beneath her simple clothing. She watched him closely, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and something deeper, something unspoken and conflicted. Her name was Ayara, a being not of this world, and she had been stranded on this barren planet for what felt like an eternity. Her species, known as the Lyran, were known for their advanced technology and near-perfect physical form. Yet, here she was, stripped of all her power and alone, her people nowhere to be found. It had been Michael who discovered her, half buried in the wreckage of a ship, and brought her here. She had been unconscious then, too, and when she awoke, she found herself in a strange place, faced with a human who had no idea who, or what, she was. For days, she had watched him, unsure whether to trust him or flee into the endless wilderness. But something kept her there, a strange, inexplicable connection she felt when she looked into his eyes, even as he slept. She could sense his kindness, his sincerity, and something else that made her hesitate. Michael had been working late in his lab when the explosion happened. He had heard a deafening crash outside and rushed to find the source. That's when he saw her, lying amidst the smoldering debris, her blue skin almost glowing in the moonlight. His first instinct was to help her, to save her, despite his lack of understanding about what she was or where she came from. He had learned a few things in the short time since she woke up in his care, enough to know she was from a race far more advanced than humanity. And yet, her eyes held a profound sadness, a lost, desperate look he couldn't ignore. Part 2, A Fragile Bond. Tonight, Ayara stood over Michael, her expression torn between distrust and a desire for connection. She had never encountered a human before, her people had forbidden contact with Earth, deeming the inhabitants too primitive, too unpredictable. But Michael was different. She had seen him risk his life to save her, had seen the gentleness in his hands as he treated her wounds, and now, watching him sleep, she felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest. She had spent the last few days in this small room, recovering, observing, trying to understand this strange being. Michael had tried to communicate, to bridge the gap between them, but Ayara had been too wary, too afraid of the unknown, to respond. Now, as she stood there, she could feel his heartbeat, slow and steady, resonating with her own. She took a tentative step closer, her hand reaching out almost instinctively, and then, without warning, Michael's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they stared at each other, neither moving, both caught in the weight of the moment. His eyes were wide, a mixture of shock and awe as he took in the sight of her standing so close, her luminous skin reflecting the dim light. Ayara's breath hitched, and she took a step back, her body tensing as if ready to flee. But Michael, sensing her fear, held up a hand, his voice gentle and calm. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice a soothing balm in the quiet room. "I'm not going to hurt you." Ayara blinked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his words. She had heard him speak before, his language strange yet somehow familiar. She had absorbed enough of it to understand him now, though speaking it herself still felt unnatural. "Why, help me?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, each word spoken with deliberate caution. Her accent was thick, her words slow and deliberate, but Michael understood. He sat up slowly, not wanting to startle her, and offered a small, reassuring smile. "Because you needed help. And I couldn't just leave you out there. It's not right." Ayara's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, but found none. She saw only honesty and a genuine concern that both puzzled and intrigued her. "You do not fear me?" she asked, her head tilting slightly, her glowing eyes never leaving his. Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little scared. But I think there's more to you than meets the eye. And I want to understand, if you'll let me." For a moment, silence filled the room. Ayara's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotion and logic. She had been trained to see humans as inferior, as a potential threat. But here, standing before her, was a man who had risked everything to save her, who looked at her not with fear or hatred, but with curiosity and compassion. "It was different, perhaps," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is more to you, too." Michael's smile widened, and he nodded, sensing a breakthrough. "Maybe we can find out together." Part 3. The chase begins. Their tentative bond was soon put to the test. As the days passed, Michael and Ayara began to learn more about each other, breaking down the barriers of fear and mistrust. She showed him fragments of her past, speaking of her world, her people, and the betrayal that led her to this desolate place. He shared his own stories, of Earth, of his life as a scientist on the frontier, of his yearning for discovery beyond the stars. But peace was not meant to last. One evening, as they shared a meal in the dim light of Michael's small quarters, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the air, a sound both familiar and dreaded to Ayara. The unmistakable whine of a search drone. Her eyes widened in panic, and she shot to her feet, her body tense and ready to flee. Michael followed her gaze, confusion etched on his face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. "Trackers," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "They have found me." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "Trackers? Who?" "No time," Ayara cut him off, her eyes darting to the window. "We must leave, now." Without another word, she sprinted toward the door, and Michael was right behind her, his mind racing. Whoever, or whatever, was coming for her, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't about to let her face it alone. Together, they fled into the night, the sound of the drone growing louder, closer, a relentless predator in the dark. As they ran, Michael glanced at Ayara, her face set in determination, her glowing eyes scanning the shadows. In that moment, he realized that this was only the beginning, that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Chapter 3. Into the depths. The cave system twisted and turned, a network of tunnels that seemed to stretch on for miles. Michael led the way, his flashlight beam bouncing off the slick, wet walls. Behind him, Ayara moved silently, her glowing eyes piercing the darkness. The tension between them had eased slightly, replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie and trust. "We should be safe here for a while," Michael said, his voice echoing in the narrow passage. "But we can't stay forever. If these Zerkith are as relentless as you say, we'll need a plan." Ayara nodded. "There is a port city not far from here. If we can reach it, I may be able to contact an ally, someone who can help us get off this planet." "An ally?" Michael asked, curiosity piqued. "Someone like you?" "Not quite," she replied, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "But he owes me a favor." Michael chuckled. "I'll take it. Let's get some rest first. We'll need all the energy we can muster." Chapter 4. The bond strengthens. Days turned into nights as they navigated the maze-like caverns, sharing stories and learning more about each other. Ayara spoke of her homeworld, Lyria, a beautiful planet with towering crystalline spires and oceans that glowed under twin moons. She described the rigid hierarchy of her society and the expectations placed upon her as a member of a powerful family. Michael, in turn, shared stories of Earth, of its chaos, its beauty, and its conflicts. He talked about his passion for exploration, his desire to understand the universe beyond the stars. Slowly but surely, their initial wariness began to fade, replaced by a mutual respect and a growing sense of companionship. Chapter 5. A dangerous descent. One night, as they huddled around a small fire deep within the cave, Michael noticed a shift in Ayara's demeanor. She seemed restless, her eyes darting to the cave entrance, her muscles tense. "What's wrong?" he asked. "They are close," she whispered. "I can feel them." Michael tensed. "How do you know?" Ayara's eyes locked onto his, her expression grim. "My people have a connection, a way of sensing one another. They are coming." They extinguished the fire and gathered their belongings, their hearts racing as they moved deeper into the cave system. The tunnels grew narrower, the air colder, and the darkness more oppressive. And then they heard it, a distant, echoing growl that sent chills down Michael's spine. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ayara's face was pale, her markings dimming. "Not all things in these caves are friendly," she said, her voice trembling. "We must move quickly." Chapter 6. The creature's lair. They pushed forward, navigating the treacherous terrain as the growls grew louder, closer. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the ground became slick with moisture. Suddenly, they emerged into a large, open cavern, and Michael's flashlight beam fell upon something that made his blood run cold. A massive, hulking creature stood before them, its eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its claws were as long as Michael's forearm. It let out a deafening roar, and Michael knew there was no turning back. "Run," he shouted, grabbing Ayara's hand and pulling her with him as the creature charged. Chapter 7. An unlikely ally. As they sprinted through the twisting tunnels, Michael spotted a narrow crevice in the rock, a potential escape route. "In there," he yelled, pushing Ayara ahead of him. They squeezed through the tight space just as the creature's massive claws swiped inches from Michael's back. Breathless and exhausted, they collapsed on the other side. Ayara looked at Michael, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. "You saved me, again." Michael managed a tired smile. "I guess we're even now." But there was no time to rest. The Zerkith were still out there, and they needed to reach the surface before it was too late. Chapter 8. The City of Shadows. After several more grueling hours, they finally emerged from the cave system into the cold night air. In the distance, the lights of the port city flickered like stars on the horizon. They made their way toward the city, moving carefully through the shadows to avoid detection. The city was a dangerous place, a hub of crime and corruption where no one could be trusted. Ayara knew this all too well, but she also knew it was their best chance of survival. She led Michael through the maze-like streets, her senses on high alert. "We're getting close," she whispered. "My contact should be in the market district. Stay close." Chapter 9. A betrayal uncovered. They reached the market district, a bustling area filled with traders, smugglers, and thieves. Ayara's contact was a man named Varen, a former bounty hunter with a reputation for bending the rules. He greeted them with a sly grin and a wary glance at Michael, I see you've made a friend, Baron said, his tone half mocking. He's with me, Ayara replied sharply. We need a way off this planet, and fast. Baron's grin widened. I can arrange that, for a price. Ayara's eyes narrowed. You owe me, Baron. Don't forget that. But as they negotiated, Michael felt a strange unease. Something about Baron's demeanor seemed off, his gaze too shifty, his words too smooth. And then it hit him, Baron was stalling. Before he could warn Ayara, a group of Zerkith mercenaries appeared from the shadows, weapons drawn. Trap! Michael shouted, grabbing Ayara and pulling her behind cover as the mercenaries opened fire. Chapter 10. The escape plan. Chaos erupted in the marketplace as Michael and Ayara fought to escape. Blaster fire tore through the air, and the sounds of screams and shouts filled the night. Michael grabbed a blaster from a fallen mercenary and fired back, covering Ayara as she sprinted toward a nearby alley. Go. I'll cover you, he yelled. Ayara hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting his. She nodded, a determined look crossing her face, and then she was off, moving with the speed and agility of her kind. Michael followed, firing off shots to keep the mercenaries at bay. Chapter 11. The underground resistance. They made their way through the winding alleys, eventually finding refuge in an abandoned building. There, they met a group of rebels, a small faction fighting against the Zerkith and their masters. The leader, a stern-looking woman named Kira, agreed to help them, but at a cost. You want our help? She said, her voice cold and calculating. Then you help us take down the Zerkith's operations in this city. Deal? Michael glanced at Ayara. She nodded. Deal. Chapter 12. Striking back with the rebels' help, Michael and Ayara launched a daring raid on the Zerkith's main base in the city. The battle was intense, with explosions lighting up the night and the sounds of blasters echoing through the streets. Michael and Ayara fought side by side, their bond strengthening with each passing moment. Together, they managed to take down the Zerkith's leader, disrupting their operations and buying themselves some much-needed time. Chapter 13. A heartfelt confession. After the battle, as they rested in the rebels' hideout, Michael and Ayara finally had a moment of peace. The tension between them had been building for days, and now, with the immediate danger behind them, it finally boiled over. I don't understand you, Ayara said softly, her eyes searching his. Why do you risk so much for me? Michael looked at her, his expression serious. Because I care about you, Ayara. More than I ever thought I could care about anyone. Ayara's breath caught in her throat. She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his face. And I feel the same. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, sealing a bond that had been growing since the moment they met. Chapter 14. Secrets revealed. Their respite was short-lived. As they prepared to leave the city, Ayara received a message from a mysterious source, one that revealed shocking secrets about her past and her family's true intentions. It seemed that her capture was part of a larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond her homeworld. We need to go to Lyria, Ayara said, her voice filled with resolve. I need to confront my family. I need to know the truth. Michael nodded. Then let's do it. Together. Chapter 15. The return to Lyria. Returning to Lyria was a dangerous gamble. The planet was heavily guarded, and Ayara's family held immense power. But they had no choice. As they descended into the atmosphere, they were met with a fleet of ships, both allies and enemies. The final confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 16. The reckoning. Ayara and Michael infiltrated the heart of her family's stronghold, facing impossible odds and uncovering the dark truth behind the Zerkith, her family's ambitions, and the web of deceit that had ensnared them all. In a climactic showdown, they fought not just for their freedom, but for the future of an entire galaxy. And as the dust settled, they stood together, ready to face whatever came next, united, stronger, and forever changed by their journey.